Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Virtual Coach Advantage podcast. I'm Emma Calvert, co founder and coach at Springboard Future. And today, as ever, I'm delighted to be joined by my co founder and our master coach, Neela Bettridge. I'm really excited to welcome Peter Fay, who is one of our brilliant coaches based out of Asia, to the podcast today. And we're going to be talking about growth mindset and why it's important for you as a leader, but also for your teams. Just want to say a really warm welcome, Peter. Thanks for joining us today.
Great, thanks for having me. It's almost happy hour here in Thailand, so I'm on a tea right now, but the gin and tonics for a bit later.
Great stuff. This is a topic that's really close to my heart, actually, growth mindset, something that I fully believe in. But I want for our managers and leaders to really, firstly, talk about what growth mindset is, because that's okay for Neela and you and I, Peter, to be sort of banding this term around. But just can we start there, Peter? What is a growth mindset? And then maybe, Neela, you can pick up on why it's so important for managers and leaders.
Yeah, sure. So for me, it's really about curiosity, I would say. It's it's about having curiosity to think differently. It's about thinking and grabbing projects that maybe are a little bit more dangerous and that people maybe don't gravitate to naturally. And it's having that sort of continuous learning mindset so that you can pick up things that maybe others don't necessarily go for in order to sort of better yourself and ultimately then your organization as well.
Great. And for me, you've hit the nail on the head, Peter. It's about that continuous learning, isn't it? It's,
Yeah.
we are never the finished article. And the moment we think we're finished article, that's when we have what we call a fixed mindset, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen this both from my own personal perspective. I would say, as I look back at my career, I can see times when I've had a fixed mindset. If I think about the sort of two halves of my career, I started off in sales, and that was really not a role that I naturally gravitated to, and a role that I necessarily enjoyed. So I think back then, now that I've got a definition of growth mindset, I can look back and say, okay, there were times whenever I wouldn't necessarily take on those extra projects, or I wasn't necessarily open to my manager's feedback or my colleagues' feedback. When I moved into HR and I moved into coaching, I could really see myself in a place where I was very passionate about it. And I could see then that I had that growth mindset. I wanted to learn more. And as part of my career, I wanted to kind of grab more, take more, and obviously then use that from a learning perspective as well.
Well, thanks for sharing that personal experience. And actually, it's probably a nice segue, Neela, to talk about why it's important, because I think Peter has picked up on the importance of it for our personal careers. Why else is it important, Neela?
It's a really interesting one. As I was listening to Peter speaking, I was actually thinking about the ingredients I think that need to be present within organizations for growth mindset. And I've been doing a lot of work with corporations recently on creating psychologically safe environments. It is very difficult for organizations to create growth mindsets or the conditions for growth mindset if it's not safe to speak up, fail, all of these things.
Hmm.
And I think it's one of the absolutely important things that we need to either create for ourselves or be in organizations that create it for us. Because it's the ability to take risk, isn't it? It's the ability to flex further than you would otherwise go. But if you're frightened or worried or think you're going to lose your job or you might there may be retaliation, you're not going to do it.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting one. You can teach growth mindset, and as we know, that this is different elements to it. There is a emotional bit to it where you're prepared to take a risk with yourself. There is also, I think, a language piece of this about the internal language on what is possible, but also external language around actually, you notice people with more growth mindsets, it's all about the possibility in their language. Whereas if somebody feels worried or frightened, they're much more likely to see all the negatives. Now, some of us actually are glass half empty as opposed to glass half full. And if you're one of those people, you need to really watch that because it could be interfering with your ability to have a growth mindset. So, some reflections for me around that, really.
Oh, you've just given me a great idea for our next podcast, Neela. Optimism. How to be optimistic, how to train yourself to be optimistic. I will write
Yes.
that one down. But there was something else in there that I want to kind of pick up on. And, you're talking about obviously the safety of the culture and, people being able to fail or being able to take risks. And often in corporate worlds today, the jobs we do are changing constantly, right? AI, robotics, digital, all of those things, which actually puts our jobs under threat. But a growth mindset is really key, isn't it, to keeping us current, reinventing ourselves. Peter, I just wondered if you've got a perspective on that.
Yeah, I just want to come back to something that Neela mentioned as well. My background prior to coaching, I was in corporate HR and facilitated many, many talent discussions. And that glass half empty piece is always a challenging one from a HR perspective, because when you're talking about people from a talent pool perspective, it's always they won't take on additional work, they don't take feedback well, they don't do this. And then you have to ask the manager, well, what are you doing to enable that environment, right? And what is the leader doing to make sure that environment is there and that feedback is respected? It's done in a kind of in a way that's, it's not sort of malicious, etc., and therefore the person can take it on board. But always these managers, whenever you're in these discussions, you see this kind of, well, they won't take this on, they won't do this, they won't do this additional work, so therefore they're not part of our talent pool, right? So there's two sides to this. One is the person who maybe is glass half empty. How do you get them to be have more of a growth mindset? But secondly, how do you make sure the manager has enabled that environment as well? So I think that's really key to it. To come back to your question, Emma, around, I think it's around why it's important in the changing environment that we're in. I love this sort of analogy of we do this in some of our programs when we're delivering them. The old takeaway menus that used to drop in through your letterbox, and we used to have piles of them, right? And you'd combine that on a Friday night with a telephone, which you'd have to spin the wheel. I'm showing my age here, and that's how you got your takeaway on a Friday night. I look at Asia. We have this app called Grab, which is Uber on the one hand, it's takeaway delivery on the other, and it's also a bank, which I find really fascinating. So it's got these sort of three very different businesses. There's no more takeaway menus, etc. Excuse me. And the premise of why I say that is if we don't adapt, somebody else is going to, right? And the takeaway company, which nobody thought was a threat to banks, is going to be a threat. And they will come along and sort of multiply in businesses that they shouldn't necessarily have been in or wouldn't have had any business being in before. So for our people and our leaders, we have to think about how do we adapt to make sure that we counter that competitive challenge that will come our way.
I love that word adaptability. And Neela, I wonder if you can bring the link between the growth mindset and adaptability. Because as Peter said, it's not just, the angle I was coming at it from with that question was about us as individuals, but actually it's so important for our businesses to be continuously adapting. So can you make that link between growth mindset and adaptability for us, Neela?
Yeah, lovely. I've really great point as well, Peter. I totally agree with you around the HR piece as well. I was very, very struck this year. Yes, it was terrible and awful and everything else, but isn't it an incredible thing that the people who had a growth mindset were able to create vaccines to help us with COVID? Now, that was adaptability and growth mindset in action, actually. And actually, I was very struck this week with COP26 and the requirement for the human race and our businesses to seriously adapt and do it very, very quickly with technology. Now, this is going to require, yes, it's absolutely dreadful. If we don't hit 1.5, we're in trouble. But I also was very hopeful when I was listening to businesses speak around how they are moving their workforces to really think about those major challenges, adapting a growth mindset and becoming very adaptable to really react to what we have in front of us. And I think many of the technological innovations that we've had, industrial revolution, etc., have reacted to that sort of existential threat that we have. Now, there will be some that will not like to adapt because it's too comfortable, but there are also many that can. And what I'm interested in the area that we are working with Springboard in technology and growth sectors, my experience of many of the people that work in those organizations is that they've got bags of this. They're all about growth mindset, what is possible, let's adapt. So, very hopeful, actually. And maybe it's the older organizations, the more established ones, that find it more difficult to be adaptable to this and change. And maybe the model for the future for this adaptability and growth mindset to be really embedded is the smaller organization. So that's just some reflection from me on that. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Neela, and it ties back to that point that Peter, picked up on, which is, what are we doing as managers and leaders to create that environment? So, it probably the types of organisations, Springboard works with that you're describing, Neela, it's part of their DNA, right? It's part of they just do it. But Peter, if it's not part of our DNA, your point you were making around the manager enabling that, what does the manager need to do to make sure
Yeah.
that we have that culture of growth mindset?
Yeah, I would take a step back as well. I think, we think about technology companies, they have this sort of ability to be creative, be innovative, whereas those older organizations maybe are regulated, for example. And this is where technology will be challenged moving forward. You think about all of the noise around regulator interest in, social media organizations, etc. That's when some of that more pressing constraints come in, and they're not allowed to be as creative, they're not allowed to be as sort of freewheeling as maybe they had been in the past. So as a leader in that environment, it's how do you create the right environment within the box, right? So you've got the box and you can't cross the line of that box. So within it you have to create the right guardrails, so the team can kind of break things, they can fail intelligently, so to speak, and not necessarily break the organization. To answer your question though, Emma, I think it's in terms of what a leader should do. I think it is the number one skill for me, and really it's helping your people to demystify what it means. All of our teams are sort of overwhelmed with the amount of development opportunities that come their way, and I think they look at things and go, okay, what am I supposed to do, right? How do I develop my
Yeah.
career? And then you see leaders that sort of treat it in some organizations like a tick box exercise. Okay, I have to have a career development discussion, and I've done that tick. The two things have to join up, right? I think the leader has to have a really purposeful discussion, and to be able to help the team members to demystify what is it you're trying to achieve. Let's say there's 1, 2, 3 roles that you're trying to get to in the next sort of 5 to 10 years. What does that mean in terms of skills? What does it mean in terms of mindset and behaviors? And the growth mindset is really one of those. So, taking on board feedback, grabbing those projects that are maybe more dangerous than others want to take on, etc. And how does the leader then spell that out for the individual? So it's an individual career development plan, for example, or whatever you want to call that, so that they can really sort of have something to focus on that's not sort of sheep dipped, if that makes sense as well. But I do think it's the
Yeah.
number one skill for any leader is to put some structure behind it, because I look at most team members and they are pretty much overwhelmed with what am I supposed to do next? How am I supposed to develop myself? Where am I supposed to go? And I think it's our role as leaders to help them demystify that.
Yeah, great points, because I think that is probably the number one thing I hear in corporates, which is we haven't got the time. We are overwhelmed often by what's on offer. We haven't got the time because the technical job seems more important than
Mm.
spending time learning, and in that growth mindset space. And I think there's a danger, as you're pointing out, not just from a career perspective, there's also that danger, back to your earlier point, about us not being innovative, not being
Mm.
creative, not being adaptable. Neela, I just wondered if you had any final thoughts to add on that.
No, I think Peter's actually captured it really, really well. And it's a very complex thing, this, isn't it? It's
Mm-hmm.
do you know what really struck me about what you were talking about? I was thinking about these older organizations that are having to work within boxes. And actually, of course, it's right that they should behave properly and they should have restrictions on certain things, but it does reduce the ability to be adaptable and also have growth mindset.
Okay.
And the question that was in my mind as I was listening to you speak, Peter, was I wonder how these organizations are going to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's going to take a hell of a leader to do what you were talking about, to be able
Yeah.
to allow people to fail intelligently. I love that phrase that you had, whilst not coming out of the box. It's really,
Yeah.
and are our leadership up to it? That I think as coaches, as team coaches, this is the area that we really need to be thinking about when we're working with our people, to allow them, how do you work in the box if we're working with very big organizations that don't have the fluidity of, the growth in the tech industries. So that
Mm-hmm.
was my reflection.
Really nice that, Neela. Again, feel another podcast coming on. We're having a lovely conversation. I hope you're enjoying listening to it. The three of us could talk for hours, but conscious of time, what are your top 5 tips, Peter?
Top 5. I think all organizations are going to feel that pain at some point, whether that's a sort of COP26 government starting to say, right, here's some more requirements on organizations, regardless of sector. Historically, the companies I'm referring to are probably banks, right, and sort of larger organizations where when something does break, it's pretty expensive, and expensive from a reputational perspective, let alone the dollar amount. So I think managers need to be ready to sort of think about, okay, how do I build this environment where people can feel, and to do that in a way that doesn't sort of break the team, doesn't break the deliverables of the organization as well. The second one is the point you made there earlier, which is around leaders not having enough time. I coach so many leaders that are doing individual contributor jobs at the same time, and they're required to be managers, and they're trying to think of their own development as well. They need to try to find help somewhere, because it's not necessarily sustainable to try to get them to be that sort of growth mindset leader for their team members. So leverage the folks that are around them, whether it's their own manager, people in the organization that they can point to that are saying, okay, well, I can see that person does have a growth mindset. How can I sort of glean from them the top 2-3 tips, for example, in that scenario where it's just time constrained and they can't necessarily get to it with their team members. And then the last one I think is really for leaders to have leaders to lead by example. So if I'm going to ask my team members to take things on, and I'm going to have this sort of growth mindset push within my team and try to build that sort of environment, you have to embody it yourself. If you are that person who is not open to feedback, or you're that person that is not necessarily sort of putting in the same amount of sort of shift as your team, etc. It's the same as any sort of behavior that you're expecting. You have to embody it within your team. Otherwise, the team members will simply not do it, which I think we know from experience as well.
Yeah.
Great tips, Peter. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Conscious also, not just of the time of the podcast, but also it's your evening time now and time for your gin and tonic. So thanks so much for joining us. We've hoped that you've really enjoyed our podcast today on growth mindset. We are the Virtual Coach Advantage podcast, and it's been a pleasure to coach you today. We'd love to hear your feedback, any comments you've got, or even requests for topics. So please do get in touch. You can reach us on our website, which is springboardfuture.com. Follow us on our LinkedIn or Twitter pages. Thanks for joining the Virtual Coach Advantage podcast. We hope to coach you again soon.